people a minute. Okay, I think we'll probably just get started, and Beverly will let people in as they come. So, good afternoon everybody, and welcome to the Neuroscience of Learning, Relevance and Prospects in Time of COVID-19 Creative Conversation. I'm so pleased that you've been able to, we have been able to include this in our series of webinars, as I believe it's so relevant to all of our work, and I'm delighted to have Professor Andrew Tolmie, who is a Professor of Psychology and Human Development at the UCL Institute of Education, who's going to take us through this. So thanks for coming along, Andrew. Next slide, Beverly. So first, I just need to go over the practical side of delivering an online session. So apologies if you've heard this before, but in case you haven't, we would ask that you please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. You'll have an opportunity to speak if you want to ask questions at the end. You can also use the chat panel to ask questions, post comments, resources, anything that you'd like to share. If you do want to talk or ask a question, please put the word speak or raise your hand, and one of the facilitators, myself or Beverly, will bring you into the conversation. This event will be recorded, so you can put your camera off if you want. If you lose connection, please refer to the email that you received. That will have the name of the person to call and get help. Lastly, we try to make these events as relaxed as possible. We encourage dialogue between peers, but it is online, so if we do have a few glitches, please forgive us. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who will start the session.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you very much to both you and Beverly for inviting me to do this session. This is actually the first of a few sessions that we're hoping people from my Centre for Educational Neuroscience will be doing. The others, we've got one in late July and another couple lined up for September, October time. Those will go into more detail about certain areas of work that the centre is involved in. What I wanted to do really today was to take the opportunity to kind of give you a little bit of kind of a flavour of how we in this particular Centre for Educational Neuroscience view things, and I suppose also to kind of give you a kind of heads up that whilst we do kind of think very seriously about learning through the lens of cognitive neuroscience, cognitive science, that's not the kind of the be-all and end-all of what we do. We try to take a very rounded, evidence-based approach to thinking about education, which, you know, the neuroscience is part of that, but it is only part of that. So, as I say, what I'm going to do today really is give you a little bit of a flavour of our thinking, and framing that really in the context of some of the things that have been happening through the pandemic, which has affected all our lives massively, and in particular the ways that might have impacted on education. I'm going to share my slides at this point, which is always a moment fraught with terror. Everything could possibly go wrong will go wrong. But let me just see if I can actually get those working properly. Okay, hold on a sec, I'm just trying to find them. Inevitably this happens, doesn't it? Okay, that's showing there. Not here.
So it's just that we share content. Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
Yes, okay, that's it. So let me do that. Just get that started. So, well, the title Susan's already given you. We're going to frame this in terms of the effects on learning of COVID-19, the pandemic. What I want to do to start off with really is just think about briefly about the effects of the lockdown on learning.
Andrew, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm only seeing your name. I don't know if that's the same for everybody else. The actual slideshow is not there.
Let me just get back to that. Okay, how's that?
me, it's just your name again. So I think what you have, so for the way that the Teams is set out now is when you press the share content, it brings up.
I can see it.
Oh, you can see it. Perfect.
Oh.
You could, and now it's gone.
You could, and now it's gone.
Let me try this one more time. Okay, is that visible?
Yes, perfect.
You can see it now. Okay. Let me go back to the beginning. Yeah, as I say, what I want to do to start off with is just think about some of the effects of lockdown on learning. I don't want to kind of go into a huge amount of detail about this, and this is just one study that I want to talk about, but it is kind of interesting and illustrative, I think. So this is looking at the impact of on learning of school closures in the context of the Netherlands, in fact. And I'll say a little bit more in a moment about why the Netherlands, but this was during 2020. The research was done by people based in Oxford University, in fact. The data were taken from the Netherlands. And what they found was through an 8-week period of closure of the schools during the lockdown in the Netherlands at that point, the average loss of learning, as far as they could measure it, was equivalent on average to the closure period itself. So on average, it was about 8 weeks loss of learning for an 8-week closure. But those effects were more pronounced for those from backgrounds of less educated families, etc., where there was more deprivation. So in fact, they'd actually gone backwards as a result of the closure rather than showing any kind of gains. And the conclusion of these authors, and this has been echoed by quite a large number of other studies as well, was that online learning on its own out of school has little benefit. And the kind of key point for thinking about this in the context of the Netherlands is that in actual fact, you may or may not be aware of this, but the Netherlands is probably about the best resourced country in the world for online learning within the home environment. And if this was the effect within that kind of context, you can only suppose that in other countries that are less well set up to deliver this kind of learning, the effect would be even worse. So the question is really why, and I think the kind of interesting thing from our point of view is that this really kind of helped us to think more clearly really about some of the kind of key things that schools are actually doing that actually lead to particular impacts on learning that are very difficult to achieve in other ways. And so in a sense, though it's been an unfortunate kind of window, it has given us a window on trying to understand something about what it is that's actually going on in schools that actually matters to learning. And I can only really, in this context, give you a snapshot of some of the things that we've been talking about, but we'll focus on two particular areas. One is to do with the cognitive and neurocognitive processes that are involved in learning, and the other is to do with the social context in which learning takes place. And what I want to do briefly is to give you an outline of why the neuroscience of learning is relevant, thinking about these effects, and how the COVID pandemic has highlighted key aspects of that. So that's what we're going to be concentrating on. I'm not going to talk for a long period. I really just want to give you a flavour of some of the things that we're kind of focused on, and then open up to wider discussion. I think that's more appropriate for this particular session. In due course, as I say, later in the year, there will be other sessions by people from CEN, which will go into some of these things in a little bit more detail, but this gives you a flavour. So the first thing, thinking about this in terms of learning processes and how different types of environments support those, I think the kind of key thing that we're focused on here really is memory processes. Now, this isn't to say that learning is by any means all about memory. It most certainly isn't. But memory plays a very key role in terms of learning, in terms of the organisation of understanding, organisation of what we might call a knowledge base. So this is knowledge of concepts, knowledge of information of different types, so what we call semantic memory, but also knowledge of ways to go about doing things. So if you like, the kind of understanding of procedures that underpin carrying out skilled tasks of different types. And we know well from research in neuroscience, cognitive science, that these kinds of aspects of memory are interplay in very kind of precise way with what we call working memory, the kind of procedural workspace, if you like, that people are engaged in when they're involved in a current activity. And there's kind of interchange between the knowledge knowledge-based and workful memory that supports current activity, but also enhances the knowledge base. So memory is really kind of fairly focal at the core of learning processes. And the point about that is that there are particular ways in which classroom teaching supports memory processes that are really important. So just to touch on a few of those. One is that when we're trying to retrieve memories, even as adults, we find that we need particular kinds of triggers or cues to aid our recall. This is particularly true for younger learners, for school children, particularly in the primary age range, and they need some support in order to do that. And one particular form of support that's really important is variation in the context in which you actually learn things. So the actual environmental cues, if you like, that are around you when you're learning things, actually provide triggers for reading for recall later events. So schools have actually grown very adept at providing exactly these kinds of cues, particularly perhaps in primary school environments, but also in secondary schools, I think, as well. So things like reading, numeracy, science spaces, where students can access relevant resources, but also they're provided with external memory aids, so things like number lines, science facts, punctuation rules, grammar rules. And what those do is provide cues to recall particular pieces of information, but they also help reduce the load on the learner in trying to retrieve that information and actually access it and manipulate it directly themselves by embedding that within the environment. It may seem in some senses kind of trivial background, and yet I think there's a lot of research to indicate that these kinds of cues are really important in supporting memory and engagement with tasks. So those are present in schools, and schools have evolved good ways of actually doing this. But when we think about this in the home environment, a lot of that is actually lacking. So online learning at home that typically lacks supports that kind, because it takes place in a single location that's not purpose designed. Despite the image of the smiling child in front of the laptop here, which is mostly what you see when you look for these kinds of images, actually you can see exactly that point, that it's just a standard home environment with no particular cues of the type that I've been talking about. And the online environments typically are not purpose-built with those kinds of cues in mind either. So there's no kind of resource of that kind to help those processes along. Now, it doesn't mean that that's not possible to create those within our own environment, but the resources available to do that are going to depend on parental education, SES in the sense of, simply what kind of financial resources people have, and the time that they have in order to actually do this. And of course, that's going to be hugely variable, and it's going to be a much worse situation typically for children from more deprived backgrounds. And SES also affects access to kind of optimal learning environment in terms of lack of distraction, access to technology, an individually dedicated workspace. So problems with any of those things are likely to impair learning relative to the classroom. It's just not supported in the home environment in the same kind of way, or it's not by default supported in the same kind of way, which I think is probably the crucial thing to know here. So that's a kind of flavour of some of the things around the kind of cognitive processes, neurocognitive processes that might be being impacted under these circumstances. But the other kind of big dimension here in this kind of context is what we call self-led or self-regulated learning. And the point about this is that in order to actually engage in use of online learning resources, there has to be an element of control by the individual learner of their own activities. It has to be led by them in themselves, or at least to a certain extent. But that's actually quite difficult for younger learners in particular. The capacities in terms of being able to direct your own kind of cognitive activity, which are part and parcel of this, are really things which only can come into play in a mature fashion during the kind of middle period of adolescence and into adulthood. So for younger learners, this is not something that they're likely to be particularly capable of doing without some form of support being provided for them. And that support can be provided through online resources themselves. We hear a lot in educational circles about the development of AI resources, where basically the material is delivered through a system that is paced according to the learner's own progress. So it becomes personalised in that sense, and material is only provided once there is a kind of clear demonstration that the learner is actually engaged with the material up to that point, and only then do they move on. The problem with that kind of system is that it really is best suited to kind of factual content where progress can actually be tracked very accurately, and it's not very good at providing explanation of the type which would actually help support more reflective learning, if you like, and plus also the overheads involved in developing these kinds of resources are extremely high, much higher than the classroom delivery, and so relatively few of these resources are actually available to schools, let alone to parents. The other thing to note here is that for the reasons that I kind of indicated about the kind of maturing of cognitive neurocognitive systems with regard to direction of personal activity, self-led learning generally requires a good knowledge base. You have to have a good understanding of what it is you're actually engaging with to some extent to start off with, and then to fit new activity within what you know already, and that capacity for self-regulation to stay motivated to kind of make sure that you kind of deal with failure appropriately, you develop new strategies, etc. These are all things which are really only kind of available to more mature learners, so probably in the kind of upper reaches of secondary school or even into university higher education. So it's not something that's typically available to younger learners. External support is actually something which works better, especially amongst younger and less advantaged learners, by helping them to sustain motivation, direct their attention, and to develop more productive behaviours in response to failure. But all those things are much better delivered by skilled teachers who can actually offer explanations and tailor their support to the needs of the learner as they progress, and they're much better at doing that than any kind of online system, kind of avatar systems that might be providing that kind of feedback. And also, some parents are able to do this, but again, much less likely to be able to do this than skilled teachers. So there are things going on around the support of the development of self-led learning that happen in schools and can happen in school environments that I think are very hard to sustain or to duplicate within online learning environments within the home. So again, a very kind of crucial aspect of what schools are capable of delivering. And that takes us into the kind of wider aspect of the social context in which learning takes place. And I think one of the problems with the kind of idea of online learning within home environments is that it's based very much on a kind of underpinning assumption, even if it's not often well articulated, that learning is a kind of individual activity. It's something that people do on their own, whereas in evolutionary terms, that is just simply not the case. We look at any other species, and we look at mostly what happens within humans or societies. Learning is a social activity. It's something which is based fundamentally on interaction between more skilled performers and less skilled performers, and it's very hard to produce that kind of interaction in online settings as well. So the kinds of well-established impact, for instance, of collaborative learning environments, collaborative learning activities, especially when they're led by teachers directing activity in very strategic fashion, the impact on that on both academic outcomes and also on social behaviour is well documented, and indeed I've been involved in much research on this myself. It's actually dependent very much on a kind of very specific kind of mix of structured activity, spontaneous interaction, and very strategic input by teachers in terms of what we call scaffolding, so supporting activity in crucial moments in ways that are very carefully tailored to how learners are actually performing at that point in time. We can, and that in turn leads to better self-regulation as well. If we have that kind of external support to begin with, then that's what leads to some aspects of this kind of self-led learning capacity. So it's very difficult to reproduce this in things like live online sessions, we can do it in part, but because there are limits on the kind of monitoring and strategic interjection on the part of teachers, because they can't see activity in the same kind of way online as they can within the school, the classroom environment. So that's limited. The capacity for spontaneous exchange is limited because in online systems, typically only kind of, one person could be talking at a time, and there has to be very much more rigid interchange. You can't have the kind of spontaneous exchange that you get in everyday conversations when people talk over each other, which actually is quite productive quite often. And you can't really do the kind of work on directing attention, sharing attention in online settings as well. It's much easier to do that within a physical environment. So again, it's the case that parental scaffolding may help to some extent when this activity is taking place within the home, but it's going to be likely to be variable, highly variable in its nature and quality. So some key points really to take from all that, and then we'll get into discussion. I think there are some beneficial points about online learning environments, and in particular something that's been pointed out is that they may create socially non-challenging learning spaces for some learners, and certainly for children who perhaps are bullied in school environments. That's a big plus potentially if the rest of it can be structured appropriately. But on the other hand, many more, and I think it is many more, learners actually need the interaction and organisation of attention that's provided by classroom environments. And I think it's no coincidence that we've seen school closures in the UK in particular, perhaps associated very strongly with increases in anxiety and depression on the part of children and teenagers because of that lack of contact and the lack of structuring of their engagement with activities that has entailed. So the school environment wins in so many different ways. It offers peer learning, it offers multiple learning spaces, physical presence of teachers, maximally synchronous learning, and also in many instances a safe environment, perhaps particularly for some children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So there are many things that the school environment actually offers, and not just to learners, but it also offers crucial professional and emotional support for teachers as well. Some of these things can be adapted to online learning, and I wouldn't want to kind of overemphasise this. It's not that we don't think that online learning has no value. I think it can offer solutions, but we have to think about this in terms of accessibility to materials and problems with closing the socioeconomic gap that come out of that. But also, I think thinking about this in a more productive fashion. One of the things that this is illustrated in very real fashion is during the pandemic is that there is a need to focus much more on better integration of learning across school and home environments. So the kind of role that can be played productively by online materials is not something where everything is being thrown on them to support learning, but it's an adjunct to learning and the kind of key things that can happen within schools. Okay, as I say, that's a very brief snapshot of some of the ways in which we think about these things. Happy to take questions to get into any kind of discussion about any of this at all. So over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. That really was very thought-provoking, and I'm sure we're probably going to have some questions from our colleagues, even if it's just to ask a question of Andrew while we have him here about some of the findings that he has presented today, or indeed some things that have just been on your mind during the pandemic in relation to your role. Eddie, do you want to come in?
Yeah, if you don't mind. Andrew, thanks very much. I absolutely agree with Susan. That was a very thought-provoking presentation and actually synthesised some of the things I think that we kind of know about home learning. But I was just wondering, as part of the research or part of your thinking, you talked about the advantage for some children when it was socially non-challenging. I'm thinking particularly about children with particular learning needs who've certainly found that in some of the discussions we've had with practitioners around that. I'm just wondering if through the research there have been any other, what we call silver linings, or things that we'd found about home learning that were advantageous to the learner or indeed to the parents and families that came through.
Well, I'm not sure there's been very good research on the kind of, the benefits, really. I mean, I think, as I say, most of the research which has looked at this has tended to do so perhaps in global terms, making comparisons between the amount of learning that was taking place there's all those questions about how we measure that, of course, but the amount of learning that seemed to be taking place during out-of-school, home learning periods compared to school, and the message from that is generally very negative. There are a few positives, I think, in general terms that come out of that. Certainly for some learners, there was greater engagement in physical activity within the home environment than there was within the school environment, which is interesting. That should be true, but perhaps that's kind of accessing very particular resources. I think we know less really about the ways in which more specifically these kinds of resources might support learners, particularly those with learning difficulties of one kind or another. There are certainly some materials which are better adapted to those kinds of circumstances, or also to work with very much younger learners as well. Later in the year, my colleague Jo van Herwegen is going to be talking about some of her work in the context of maths, and one thing that we know from that is that there are app-based resources that seem to be very productive for younger learners in particular, kind of early years, in supporting early kind of acquisition of number concepts and working with numbers and things like that. But all that work tends to be taking place in contexts where there is still the kind of external support being provided whether by teachers generally or by specialist teachers, specialist support workers. And so it becomes very difficult to actually disentangle the impact of that kind of support from the learning that's being generated by the materials themselves. So, one suspects from some of the things that I've been pointing out today that actually that external support seems to be a kind of crucial part of that. The most successful online resources in terms of the evidence that we have available tend to be those which are embedded actually in classroom context rather than in home environments. So that seems to point very much in that same direction. And yet, I think if there's been a kind of a silver lining from all this, I think there is. It is that it has actually kind of pointed us more into the kind of things that we need to look at in order to make these kinds of resources more effective. I think the problem was previously that we couldn't perhaps see so very clearly what it was that was being productive about and what was not being productive about the kind of online learning resources. And I think that's kind of clearer now what the picture should be on that, of where we need to look to improve support using these. And it's not a matter of ruling those out. I think that's a crucial thing, but it's a matter of finding better ways of using it, I think. That's a very long-winded answer, and I don't think we came to any conclusion about silver linings there at all, but there you go.
Is that okay, Terry?
Yes, thanks very much. Susan, really interesting stuff.
It is, and I think in a utopian society, Andrew, given that you had said that having the parents involved in the learning is of benefit as well, but obviously we would have to make sure that those parents are equipped to do that. So I think there's probably something about that kind of joint home school approach for us moving forward, and some lessons to be learned from that. So we do have a question from Sally, but we did have one in our chat panel from Mr. Mathis. I don't know if you want to come in. Apologies, I don't know your first name.
Hi Susan, how you doing? It's good to see your face again. I think last time
gosh, yeah, hi.
You're right. Thanks, Andrew, for your presentation, first and foremost. I suppose my question really relates into what Susan was saying there. With the limitations around social distancing and considering what we need to be doing with regards to sort of trying to upskill parents and bridge that gap between the home and the school divide, how do you think we can use virtual spaces to do that? Any tips or pointers, or have you heard of any particular models that you think have perhaps worked really well that you could highlight at this point?
Very good question. I'm not aware of any kind of particular models that have taken this forward very successfully. I think, unfortunately, but I think there are some kind of key pointers really. I mean, firstly, going back to the point that I was making about the kind of the social context of learning being something which is writ large within our evolutionary history. I mean, this is how in traditional societies learning takes place still, to the extent that those are not being changed by current circumstances. And I think we need to take from that a lesson that is also being echoed by more contemporary research, which is that actually many adults, many parents actually have a fairly good, what we might call slightly tendentiously instinctive capacity for engaging in this kind of thing. And I think the problem in some senses is often that they lack the confidence to actually do that, and they lack an awareness of what it is they're doing that's right, as opposed to what it is they might be doing that's not right. So I think when there's some classic research where you're asking parents to take on the role of teachers, and they kind of act out what they think a teacher does, which of course is not actually what a teacher does, and also they don't do it very well. Actually they need to rely much more on their kind of more intuitive judgments about how, for instance, you would help a child with counting or something of that kind. Now, I certainly don't want to run away with the notion that everybody is going to be great at doing that, and some people will perhaps need more support and more kind of guidance as to what effective ways of doing this might actually look like. But I think it's plain that a lot of this is within the capability of parents if they direct what to look at and how, just in very simple terms, to help their children with learning tasks. I think that's something which is very achievable. I think that what we need is better resources to actually provide parents with that kind of information, and then ways of engaging with them as far as that's concerned. I'm very aware that there is a kind of framework in Scotland for encouraging this kind of integration, which I think is really, really important, and in particular involvement of parents in school settings as well perhaps helps with that kind of communication. I think that's really what we need to work on, is just refining that kind of integration. But to take one kind of example of this, it was a big study that was done a few years ago in the US, looking at engaging parents and supporting children's attentional development, and just simply providing parents with very kind of clear, simple guidelines of things to do within the home environment with their children. And it produced a massive increase in attentional capabilities on the part of children from really very disadvantaged backgrounds. So, this is well within striking distance. We can just kind of get those strategies refined a bit better, and that's the crux of it. Thank you.
Thank you too. We've got a couple more questions. I'm going to go to Sally first, if that's okay, Jackie. Sally's had her hand up. Are you there, Sally? You're on mute, Sally.
The favourite line of the pandemic, you're on mute.
I'm glad I was the first to be advised that in this session. Andrew, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. It just made me really think about kind of what's been provided in terms of information and understanding to children and young people, and what we can use from what's coming out of research. I think a lot of children and young people that we've heard from have just really sort of expressed this sense of feeling that it was kind of difficult, learning at home was difficult, but not being able to understand why, and kind of looking for the reasons for that. So I think that was my main kind of reflection from when you were talking, just thinking this, there's some real core things in there that we can use to help our children and young people explain this what they've been through, and why there were specific areas of challenge. So yeah, really thinking about that, but also just absolutely agree for what you've just said about information for parents. Clear simple guidelines, but just some of those core things about why, the little things that could help, that would make a difference should we ever be in this position again, which hopefully we won't.
There you go. But yeah, I mean, I think that's, to throw something else that's important into the mix there. And so, yes, very much important to engaging parents in productive fashion with this, and that's very achievable. But I think as far as children, teenagers themselves are concerned, I think to some extent they are also sold on this kind of mythology about learning being an individual experience, and they don't recognise perhaps the importance of the social context of their own learning. They don't recognise perhaps very visibly what's going on within those contexts that actually supports learning. And so I touched on work that I've been involved in collaborative learning over a number of years. But the key thing there is that those exchanges that happen between learners, between peers, are actually a really important adjunct to supporting learning as well. And that's in the context of quite formal tasks, really, where people have specific activities to be engaged in. But actually, the kind of conversations that go on in a much more casual fashion between learners are probably equally important in terms of elucidating exactly what it is you don't understand, why you don't, and also just think things like the confidence that comes from realising that other people don't understand something like you, and that you're not some kind of dummy because you don't understand it and everybody else does. So there's a lot of social stuff going on between learners, I think, which is actually kind of crucial to this. I mean, it'd be interesting to see whether the coming back to school after the pandemic has actually heightened learners' awareness of the importance of these things. I mean, I think we're seeing that to some extent with the university students. I think are very aware that the kind of exchange that goes on more informally between them is really important. I'm not sure whether it's still down to school level, but that would be an interesting thing to look at, actually.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Thanks, Sally. I'm going to ask if we could go to Jackie. Are you there, Jackie? Could we just bring you in for your question?
Yep, no problem at all. Thanks, Susan. I suppose really it was just reflecting on what you were saying, and certainly when I'm meeting with head teachers in schools, what I'm hearing, especially when we first came back after the pandemic, after lockdown, about the impact on children's sort of concentration, their social learning, their physical skills, as well as their sort of core literacy and numeracy. And I was just wondering if you'd found that in your research. And then it made me reflect on a conversation this morning with some educational psychologists, and they spoke about a rise in the referrals to them around anxiety and attendance. So it was just to see whether or not those were the things that you'd sort of been hearing about as well, and what is it what do we need to do next if there's research around there? Not a big question at all.
The impact on anxiety levels is very real. It's been documented in large scale through a number of studies now, and the effects are dramatic. I mean, shift from maybe something like about 10% of students expressing anxiety problems before the pandemic, going up to something like 40 to 50% during the pandemic, which is a massive increase. Of course, that will be varying in severity, and variation in severity will have an impact on how long it takes for those situations to actually become, redressed in some way or another. I think more strategic intervention is probably needed to help children with anxiety problems. But yeah, I mean, this is part of the kind of more general picture of supporting positive mental health within schools that's been happening anyway. But I think there's a kind of very urgent need for that at the moment. The question about attentional capacity is actually a really interesting one, and we have indeed, my colleague Rebecca is, I believe, somewhere in the audience here. We've been talking about exactly that, and there is actually some evidence which suggests that the impact of the lack of direction of attentional resources within home learning environments has had quite a pronounced effect on sustained attention. So there's evidence that we're going to be seeing many more children with attention problems coming through, and that may take a lot more remediation, in fact, than the anxiety. I mean, it's, to some extent, these may well be linked, of course, as well. It's the other thing. We have been trying to get some research off the ground that actually looks at the extent of that problem, and it's not happened yet, but that's certainly in our minds to do something along those lines. I think, actually, from our perspective, as I say, that seems more likely to be the bigger long-term issue, that we've created a cohort of learners who really are having struggles, perhaps particularly the younger learners, with that kind of thing. It may take a long while to recover from that. In very strategic fashion, we need very strategic support, I think, to do that.
Yeah, it's going to be a huge area. I think in any research that you guys are doing, it'd be great to hear about it and be able to share with our colleagues in Scotland. We have a couple more questions, but Rebecca is here. She did say hi. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Rebecca, before we move on.
I was concerned that you were going to call me because I was actually live.
You could have said no.
I don't have anything to add, really. I mean, I see somebody put in the chat about loss of stamina for learning, which I think could possibly be related to the point we were just talking about. But I think to gain funding for a study that looks at the different profiles, this is what you were calling me on the attentional capacity. Yeah, okay. The attentional profiles of children who've had very different experiences throughout the pandemic. So if they have frontline workers and were in school, or parents who were frontline workers, so they were in school, or they were out of school because their parents weren't. Were they in rural environments? Were they not in rural environments? And then you can add into that the impact of possibly long COVID, because there is some evidence for long COVID having an effect in children's development, particularly the frontal lobes, because they're the most resource-hungry part of the brain. So there's all this stuff that we don't know, and as Andy said, we could be looking at a cohort of children who moves through the school system that have quite severe attentional problems. But, so that's all I have. I can lie back down.
Thanks, Rebecca. And we are going to be working with Rebecca moving forward, so please look out for that. We will be sending out some information. So the next question, I think, was from Tina. Tina, are you there? You've got a couple of questions, I feel.
Sorry, it always takes me a minute to find my mute button and my unmute button. Yes, it was just really, I suppose, the observation that parents have done an awful lot over the last year and a half and have struggled with it and tried and everything else. So I guess the observation was that, as someone's already said, that parents have probably never been more involved in their learning, whether they wanted to be, or their children's learning, whether they wanted to be or not. And it's just kind of looking at how do we capture that, because our sense from what parents tell us is they went from 100% involvement to not really knowing much about what their child is learning when they went back into school. So we're concerned at Connect that this connection between home school is being lost, because schools have so many other teachers have so many other things to do. The other observation was really about parents of additional support for learning, or children and young people with additional support for learning needs, and how much they struggled over the last year, and how hard they found it to support or encourage or get any learning or schoolwork done at home at all, because these children were without their routines and their tailored support in school. And it's just again to ask, how on earth are we going to, this big question, how are we going to try and help and support these children and these families? Because those parents feel that their children are struggling more than ever and have kind of gone backwards in their learning. Sorry, big questions.
Yeah, and I don't know that I have great answers for those either. I think absolutely right to point at the fact that we should be looking at much more care actually at what the parents' experience has been. And I have to say I've not seen so very much work that's attempted to do that. The focus has been very much on the learners, and for very good reasons, of course. But I think actually finding out more about what the parental experience has been under different circumstances and how that was positive and what made it positive, where it was positive and what was negative and what were particularly kind of important things to know about in terms of difficulties. Actually, that is really a very urgent piece of research, I think, and certainly something to put very, very much on the radar. Yes, thank you. I don't have more to add than that, really, except to acknowledge that that's really important.
Thanks, Andrew. I think, can we bring in Leslie Davidson? You've got your hand up, if that's okay.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm not sure if I've got a question or just a comment, really. I work with parents, and over the time, sort of trying to express their anxiety, and when we're looking at the children's anxiety, then it's part of a whole family, whereas the parents didn't feel as though they were able to do the home learning. So then you would say, well, what are you doing? And they said, oh, we just baked cakes. I didn't want to do, I couldn't help them with the sheets that the teacher had given or the online learning, so we went for a walk or we went. So it's maybe sometimes that's not really recognised in terms of then lifting the parents' anxiety, because they just think because they're not doing all the sheets or the online, they're not contributing. And I had found some really good links. Actually, it was from Twinkle, to sort of say, well, what were you doing? Oh, we were out and we made rockets with the bottles. So then I'm saying, well, that's health and well-being, it's expressive arts, it's technologies. So sometimes maybe even being able to, for the schools, to let the families know that these activities do have curriculum links. And for me anyway, all the parents, their anxieties is really high, and a lot of children are still having late attendance or not attendance because mum just can't get out of the house at the moment. So
Thank you for that, and I think that importantly that's reminding me that there is actually quite an extensive, well-developed literature on homeschooling that talks about exactly these kinds of issues, really, and how actually, certainly for children in the primary school years, parents who engage in homeschooling very frequently find that there's more kind of unstructured activities that are actually the easier ones to engage in, but it doesn't seem to have particularly kind of negative consequences for children's learning. So I think there's some messages to take from that about the importance of approaching learning in different ways, and ways that might actually be more appropriate within a home environment. It's actually the kind of emphasis on the online learning resources is very heavily towards keeping the kind of nature of the activities that children are engaged in within the kind of remit of the things that they would be doing in school, but maybe we should be thinking about what home environments have to offer in a very different fashion, and the kinds of more informal activities that actually might be very productive for learning, very enriching, but not structured in that same kind of way. That might actually be a better avenue to be exploring, and would actually help, perhaps also help parents to feel more confident about what they're doing, and as opposed to thinking that they're failing to duplicate something that would be very difficult for them to duplicate in any way, in any fashion.
Thanks, Andrew. I wonder if I could go back to a question from Amanda Hamilton. I don't know if you're there. I was really interested to hear that you had found, or you'd been hearing about there being a loss of the stamina for learning question, but particularly with boys. I don't know if you want to come in and say something about that. That's quite interesting.
Hi, Susan. Yes, it's part of a kind of wider focus that I've got going on at the moment. It's my work as attainment advisor working with East Lothian Council, and they're looking at the kind of underperformance of boys more generally, but anecdotally, because of that lens and focus, what teachers have found is that boys are taking longer to re-engage with learning than girls have, but their stamina, particularly around right time, is very, very poor, and they feel like they've almost made a lot of regression really, in terms of where they were and ability, but also in terms of the length of time that they could kind of maintain certain tasks. So I don't have any concrete evidence of it, but a lot of anecdotal evidence from schools reporting that. And I know, having spoken to colleagues, that they're hearing similar things as well. I don't know whether there's anything within the study that was focused around gender about the impact. And I know we know a lot about kind of the disadvantaged gap that there is, but whether there's also a gender gap in terms of how it's impacted, how lockdown and COVID has impacted. Be interesting to know. Thanks, Susan.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any work that's particularly looked at that, and that sounds like something that really does need some attention too. Certainly, I think there have been indicators over a longer period of time that boys perhaps tend to have greater problems with attentional issues than girls do, and whether that's to do with the way in which they're actually having their activities structured, scaffolded, that may be part of the answer there, that adults engage with boys perhaps in a different way to the way in which they engage with girls, and that leads to that kind of greater need for external support, perhaps to manage their attentional capacities. And lockdown, school closures might have impacted more negatively. I'm speculating. I'm totally speculating here, but I think that's a really interesting issue to examine.
Yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. Thank you, Amanda. And probably off the back of that one, we've got another question from Mr. Mathis, if he wants to come back in, and it's really around parents' fatigue as well. So I don't know if you're still here.
Hello, always here. My question really, I suppose, just going back to the idea of sort of parental engagement and how kind of we work together with them. We've found that it is anecdotal. I can only speak to one setting. We found that we continue to use Google Classroom for our homework provision, to make sure that they don't lose those skills, just in case. And we've also, we keep going with like our weekly blogs, so parents have got access to information. But, I was just wondering if there is, and it might sound contrary or I don't want to, sway ideas or whatever. But I was just wondering, with regards to parent fatigue, is there any evidence that parents are coming back and saying, actually, do you know what, I would like to continue to support my child, but actually just the prospect of going back to that again is really, really daunting, and whether they find that as an additional barrier as opposed to supporting learning within the home?
I've not seen anything systematic on it, but I have to say that I've seen anecdotally things which point very strongly at that, actually. But by the time it got to yet another round of school closure, the reaction of people that I know was one of abject horror that they were having to do this yet one more time, and really found it very difficult to contemplate actually, going through that. And that's really important message to note there. And I think it just kind of goes back to the point that I was making earlier, which I don't have a good answer for at the moment, but I think we need to be doing urgently some work with parents to find out their perceptions about this, because they will forget it very quickly, unfortunately, as other things move on. In 6 months' time, they probably won't be able to tell you about 5% of what they could tell you at the moment, and even what they could tell you right now is probably reduced significantly over the last month. So we do need to actually collect some data on that pretty urgently. We need to have some conversations with colleagues about that one actually. But having to have some systematic data on that would be great and really helpful.
I think you've got quite a few things to go away with, Andrew.
Yeah,
so.
I do.
Thanks everybody's contribution. Yeah, we've only had 5 minutes left, so I was just going to end on one question, which was from Tina. But I suppose it's more of a statement, Tina, about how some children who did find school stressful, or were perhaps at the higher level of absenteeism, did actually thrive during during lockdown. Did you want to expand on it?
I don't think it was also like shy children. I mean, I think Andrew said there were certain types of learners, perhaps on the autistic spectrum, who find school noisy and stressful, who did seem to thrive at home, and also shy children who find school a bit overwhelming seem to do fine at home. So we did get some parents saying, their child was really thriving. I think they had lots of outdoor activities and things going on. But yeah, I think really interesting difference about the levels of outdoor activities, because of course that was all we were allowed to do, and how parents, when they could, worked hard at that, to help children's well-being. So.
Yes, I mean, I think it's important to note that there were definitely, I think, some children for whom this was not a disadvantage at all. But I think we need to understand more about, what was happening there. Is this just simply their own characteristics, or were there other things that were going on that might be important? Thank you for pointing there at the kind of role of external activity and things like that, because we are actually collecting. This one thing we're actually doing at this moment, we're collecting data on the role that engagement with physical activity and outdoor spaces might have had in terms of reducing increases in anxiety. I mean, we don't have that data available just yet, but we should have that within the next 4 weeks or so. And that will be instructive as to whether there were particular things about kind of external activity away from the home environment, but still in some senses home learning, that might have actually been more productive. But we will happily feedback on that one in due course.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrew. I believe, is that you?
Yes, I was just saying Leslie had her hand up again. I don't know if you've got a minute just to bring Leslie back in.
Sure. Sorry about that, Leslie. I didn't see.
Oh, that's all right. I'll put my camera on, I think, this time. It was just to sort of say a lot of the outdoor work that we were doing, I think it did make a difference. But if nobody's recognising what parents were doing, then how can you capture it? And also, at the beginning of lockdown, the first lockdown, I feel as though everybody bombarded the parents and the families to do stuff when we were all just trying to get our head round a pandemic. And it took the parents a wee while to sort of get up to speed. Then once they sort of got into it, and then when we were able to do a lot more outside, and I think the second part of lockdown after Christmas, I think that was the hardest for most. And I think if they could have maybe been given instructions in terms of, here's some paper sheets, but also, why don't you go out and build a snowman, and this is the links, so that it was more about family connection and family learning. But whereas that wasn't, it was all like online, meet your teacher at 9 o'clock and do all this, and a lot of panic. I think there's been loads of really good stuff from the schools and the teacher, and everybody's shattered. I think we're all fatigued, but I just recognise that everybody was doing is brilliant. That's all.
Thank you for that. Yes, we share within the university sector your feeling of fatigue. We're worn out from trying to juggle all this stuff online as well. Yeah, I mean, I think, responding to a very difficult situation this way is required, real depths of resources. Rebecca saying him lying on the sofa, yes. It's required real reach into the depth of our resources to actually do this. And, let's hope it doesn't happen again, but maybe we can learn some kind of key lessons that will actually help us manage things if it did, and to help other activities too. I think that's really important.
Yes, indeed. It has been a challenging time, but we definitely have lessons to learn, and hopefully, yes, it never happens again. Okay, so I'm going to just thank Andrew very much for coming along today. His presentation really was very, very thought-provoking, but most of all, thanks to everybody else for joining in the conversation. I'm sure Andrew really appreciated the questions and the conversation as well. We will be sending out the evaluation along with the slides. So I just wish you all a very good night. And for those that are finishing up on Saturday for your 8-week holiday, have a lovely holiday. I'm very jealous. So thanks very much for coming. Andrew, I don't know if you've got anything you wanted to end on?
No, just to say thank you very much for your attention, your fantastic questions and engagement with all that. And well, as we've already tried, we'll be having more engagement between our centre and your grouping, and we'll look forward very much to being part of further sessions in the future. It'd be great.
Okay, thanks everybody. Have a good night.